Angry Moderate, May 24th? Wow, 2012. Wow, it's hot out. Finally, we get some spring weather. I mean, I came inside and I was schwitzing. Now, there aren't a lot of people in the Upper Valley who are going to be familiar with the term schwitzing. Those of you who are familiar with that term, we know, yes. We share the faith, maybe the cultural side, maybe the religious side, but we know, yes. Those of you who don't know, I'm sorry. There's not much I can help you with there. So you could go Google it maybe. I don't know if you can Google to schwitz, but you could try. Anyway, Angry Moderate, May 24th, 2012. There's always a lot to talk about, particularly, it's a tough word. By the way, that's one of my most difficult typing words. You know how there are certain words that you type on the computer that always come out sort of, for me, particularly, always comes out wrong. I even know it before I start typing it. I'm like typing along, and I'm getting to particularly, and I know it's going to be misspelled, and I know I'm going to have to go backspace, backspace, backspace. It took me a long time to figure out that those little arrows where you can go into the word and then correct a letter as opposed to erase the entire word. That took me a long time to figure out. But the Angry Moderate, me, is very self-forgiving. And so I did not feel shame surrounding that computer faux pas. I felt good once I had finally overcome that obstacle. So here we are in White River Junction at the studios of CATV, and there's a sculptor close by. And I can hear him hammering and then drilling. It sounds more like a dentist for dinosaurs. So if I occasionally pause and go, listen, maybe we will hear the sculptor drilling and or hammering. If I had a hammer, anyway, sorry. Angry Moderate's going to read from the New York Times, and we're going to talk about we're going to do a few letters to the editor and a couple of articles from Business Day, and we'll do our other prattle on, prattle off about economics, history, politics, whatever we find interesting to share today on this beautiful spring day. Questions of fair play arise in Facebook's IPO, initial public offering, process. Now, do you ever have those moments where you read an article or you hear something on the news? It's like a new study, multi-million-dollar study, has shown that eating 4 hot dogs a day can cause obesity. And you're like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Wow, I didn't know that. I'm going to have to cut down and not have my 4 hot dogs a day. As if this is some extraordinary revelation that nobody would have thought that eating 4 hot dogs a day might lead to even the smallest bit of obesity. Well, questions of fair play arise in Facebook's IPO process. Now, as we all know, if we are conscious on this earth, Facebook, the company, had held an initial public offering. They offered stock to the public for the first time earlier this week. And the stock was initially valued at $38 a share. And then everybody kind of buys in, and then, people who buy in hope the stock goes up. Anybody who works for the company, who has a stake in the company, they've been paid and have shares in the company based upon their contract, their employment. So the minute, they have this, they're 30,000 or 60,000 or 100,000 shares, all of a sudden they're trading at $38 or $30 or whatever. They don't care. They can cash out if it's allowed based upon their shares, the rules of play. And they're fine. They're done. Millionaires done, right, in a heartbeat. But everybody else is bidding for these stocks. Do you hear the hammering? They're trying to bid up the value of the stocks so that they can make money. Anyway, let me read to you. This is the hot dog story, right? This is the multi-million-dollar study by some group, some really important group at Johns Hopkins, telling us that 4 hot dogs a day may, in fact, cause obesity. Check this out. As Washington intensifies its scrutiny of the initial public offering of Facebook, the company's bankers are facing questions about whether the process, even if perfectly legal, was fair. The concerns center on Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and other banks right away, right? These guys, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citi, the most extraordinarily dishonest institutions possibly in the history of civilization. Their entire goal to make money. Doesn't matter how. They use the word fiduciary responsibility as a way to legitimize fraud, racketeering, malfeasance, any kind of trickery and treachery that they to make money. And they say, look, my responsibility is to make as much money for my clients and for the bank as is possible. So it doesn't matter how I get there, it only matters that I get there. Unbelievable disingenuousness and dishonesty. All right, so right away, right, here we are. Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and other banks involved in the IPO that shared a negative outlook about Facebook with a select group of clients rather than broadly with all investors. In the days leading up to Facebook's debut, analysts at several banks ratcheted down their growth estimates for the social network. The move came after the company told these people, that quarterly and annual revenue would be on the softer side, said people briefed on the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity, right? Don't tell anybody, but we knew in advance that that Facebook was actually not going to be as profitable. Okay. Anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the issue publicly, right? Not authorized. Anyway, hot dogs. As is typical in the IPO process, research analysts at Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and other firms contacted certain clients to discuss their revised expectations, while other big investors called on the banks to get their new take. But ordinary mom and pop investors did not have the same access to the valuable information. Now, regulators and lawmakers are taking a closer look. Of course, that would be if the regulators and lawmakers aren't in on it themselves, right? I mean, if you're a regulator and someone says, hey, I have inside information that the IPO, the Facebook IPO, is going to tank. I have inside information based upon the revenue expectations of Facebook that the IPO at $30, $38 a share is going to go down probably by a good $10 a share in the first month. And the regulators are like, oh, well, you shouldn't be telling me that. I could make a lot of money. Ah, to heck with regulation. I'm going to make myself some money. You get the hot dog thing here, right? Like, as if this is some extraordinary revelation. As if somehow the fact that Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are doing something that, oh my gosh, is somehow, they've never done this before. Oh, they're really quite honorable institutions. We are shocked. Look, these institutions are money-making institutions. They don't care how they get there. They just get there. What was it, Citibank recently that had to admit that it lost $2 billion in trading? I can't remember which of the mega banks it was. And they're like playing this game of being, all embarrassed, etc. They don't care. The $2 billion in losses that they experienced in trading these derivatives, we talk about derivatives all the time. These totally complex synthetic financial instruments that nobody understands, but that everybody loves to gamble on. They don't care if they lose $2 billion. They don't care if they lose $20 billion in the marketplace, and I'll tell you why. Number one, they have active people within their organization betting against the very instruments that they're bidding for. They're playing both sides of the table, both sides of the arena. That's number one. And number two, every time a bet is made, every time a bet is placed, every time there's any kind of a trade, they get a commission, right? A commission. Commission. They don't care. What do they care if the money? So they lose $2 billion. Worst case scenario, they go to Ben Bernanke and the Fed, to the Treasury Department, and they say, bail us out. And what does Ben Bernanke do? He bails them out. What does the Fed do? What does the Federal Reserve? What does the Treasury do? Bails them out. Don't you get this game? Coffee. This is not a game. Remember, coffee is not a game. If you would like to not play games, drink coffee. Don't you understand what an extraordinary dance this is? What a charade this is? The big banks, the mega banks, bet against themselves all the time. They buy credit default swaps, insurance, hedges against their own bets. They might even actively operate against their own bets as a way to make the market go down. They create the markets. They create fluctuations in the markets on purpose in order to milk the markets, in order to make money on the markets. Look, these institutions, which can use extraordinary amounts of leverage, debt, in order to place bets, and with no impunity and with no risk. There's no risk for the big banks. Why is there no risk for the big banks? Because the government would never let them fail. AIG was not allowed to collapse. The government bailed out AIG, which had credit default swap, what's the word I'm looking for, when you are exposure, of hundreds of billions of dollars in derivatives and default swap exposure out there in the marketplace. And they said, well, we can't pay these things off. And the government said, well, we're not going to let you fail, because if you fail, it's going to bring the economy down. What do these institutions care? Do they care about their individual investors? No. Do they care about whether or not they're telling the truth? No. Do they care about whether or not they're betting on one side and then betting on the other side, playing both sides of the table? Of course not. Their entire goal is to make money for themselves and to make money for their wealthiest clients. Can they do that in the process of losing $2 billion in other bets? Sure they can. Look, questions of fair play arising in Facebook's IPO is kind of a silly headline. There is no fair play out there when it comes to Wall Street and the stock market. If you are betting on stocks in the stock market, you're no longer betting on the value of companies based upon profitability or what they give back to society or blah, blah, blah. You're betting against server farms, networks of computers running high-speed algorithms that are betting, hundreds of millions of dollars in teeny-weeny micro increments as a way to game the markets, to pump the market up and then to bring it down, push it up, bring it down. It has nothing to do with underlying values of corporations anymore. It has nothing to do with fair play. It has to do with gaming. It's just gaming. It's just gambling. And it's all done now from the inside. Look, every article that you read, Buffett's Goldman deal is topic in an insider case, insider trading. It's all insider trading if you're part of the top 5%. Because you're privy to information that everybody else isn't. If you're Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, you have access to information that other people don't. If you have access to information that Facebook's IPO is going to be flat or is going to go down, what do? You short. You bet against it. And you tell a few select clients to bet against it too. And they make a killing. And all of the mom and pop investors who are like, oh, Facebook, I love Facebook, throw their thousands of dollars into Facebook, lose money, and everybody says, well, that's the risk you take. If you're going to gamble in the stock market, that's the risk you take. But it's not a free market. Look, Mitt Romney and these right-wing individuals, do you hear it? Now listen. Do you hear the drilling? That's the sculptor. These folks on the right who talk about a free market system, whether it be the snake oil salesmen who run the AM radio shows, their whole free market thing is they need to be able to continue to convince the world that this is a free market system because it's the way they make their millions. This whole idea of it being a free market is silliness, is hilarity, is comedy. It's like Seinfeld. It's not. It couldn't be farther from a free market. It's a market that is gamed by insiders. and where if you are part of that top 5%, you know more than everybody else. And if you're part of the top 1%, you know more than everybody else. So you can bet against and for things going up and down, stocks going up and down, commodities going up and down, the bond market, the fluctuations in the bond market, the fluctuations in the Forex markets, and because you have access to information that other people don't. Look, Congress does it. Congressmen and women build up their portfolios right and left, Republican and Democrat. Congressmen and women build up their portfolios because they have access to information that you and I don't. Is this something that we need to be outraged about? Perhaps the outrage is almost a waste of energy. I think the part that I find amusing is that we are so reactive and so anti-intellectual that we think that the fact that all of a sudden this article, it's like, oh my gosh, do you mean that it's not fair? Like as if this is some extraordinary bit of information, when of course it's not fair. That's what you get for living in a capitalist system. That's what you get for living in a system that is controlled by a certain echelon, a certain social class, a certain amount of or number of wealthy people and corporations. Is that bad? Here's the clincher. Here's like the $64,000 question. Is it bad? That I have no idea. Like there are many of you out there who say, well, of course it's bad because it's dishonest. Yeah, but I mean, maybe the dishonesty, maybe the fact that we live in a dishonest society that is called free market but it's not free market at all, and yet keeps a standard of living at a certain level, maybe that's good. Maybe it's better to live in a totally dishonest system in which democratic ideals are used as sound bites, but where they really don't exist to a great extent, right? Where the rule of law really exists for the wealthy, and the rule of law for the poor is a whole different rule of law. Sure, there's a body of law, but that body of law is not applied equally. The body of law in our country is not applied equally. Anybody who would make the argument that the body of law in our country is applied equally is selling you something. If you're wealthy and you commit the same crime as a poor person, the poor person sits in jail and waits for their trial because they can't pay bail, and the rich person pays their bail and they go hang out on the beach. That's not law being applied equally. So to assume or to say that we live in a society that upholds these values, well, like, of course, that's naive, but maybe it's okay. I mean, maybe it's okay that we live in a society in which these values are kind of a charade because our standard of living is pretty high, right? I mean, maybe that's all right. Maybe it's okay that you have an IPO process that favors the top, 5%, that Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Bank of America and Citi, who are totally dishonest institutions, who would invest in the most nefarious businesses as a way to make money. I mean, I bet you that if we looked at all of the businesses that Goldman's and other banks, these mega banks invest in, we would find that they invest, for example, in technologies that are used by governments, dictatorships, to spy on their people, right? As long as it makes money, who the heck cares? Now, I remember back in the 1980s, there was a lot of talk about universities. We were protesting back then, the students who were in universities. We were concerned that universities' investment portfolios had stocks in their portfolios that with corporations that did business with nefarious, evil, wicked governments like the apartheid government in South Africa. And universities had these mottos, right? I went to Brandeis University, which had this motto, truth, even unto its innermost parts. Oh, what a beautiful, beautiful saying. A university that was founded, if I'm not mistaken, in 1948 as somewhat of a refuge for Jewish people who were leaving Europe and coming to the United States as a place where they could go to college, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States in the late 1940s, and Jewish people couldn't go to certain colleges. And so here you have this institution founded based upon these extraordinary ideals and values. named after one of the most liberal-minded, in a classical sense, justices. I don't mean liberal as in liberal and conservative. I mean classical liberalism. Louis Dembitz Brandeis. That got to a certain point in its history, this was, back in the 1980s, where the investors, the people who were in charge of the investment managers, they said, well, we have a fiduciary responsibility. Our responsibility is to build up the portfolio of the university. That's our most important task, and if it means investing in a company that does business with apartheid, then so be it. That's not our problem. That's not our issue. We don't have to deal with that. We're simply, and we were like, then how can you have the motto, truth even unto its innermost parts? I mean, maybe you should change the motto to truth as long as that truth is profitable. And I thought we had a pretty good point. But here's the deal. Maybe that's okay. Maybe it's all right that we live in a society that is dishonest. Maybe it's okay that we live in a society in which Goldman Sachs and these other banks, these other mega banks, make billions and billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars for their investors and for themselves as a way to create a society, that creates a standard of living that is a better standard of living than people around the world. I mean, maybe that's okay. Maybe the fact that Goldman Sachs plays its own investors off against each other, without telling them, of course, and does so in such a way that, that creates losses for some and gains for another, and that in many ways is totally unfair, maybe that's okay. I mean, can't really answer that one. I mean, I guess you kind of have to answer that one, like as to whether or not living in a society in which we use the words of democracy and the words of fairness and the words of morality, and we toss them around, and we say things like freedom, etc., and so forth, but we actually live in a society that favors a certain social class and then disfavors another social class. Maybe that's all right. Because in the end, even the people who are poor and middle class have a higher standard of living than the people who are poor in other countries. Right? I mean, maybe you'd rather be poor in the United States than be poor in some other countries around the world. I don't know. That one I don't know. But I did want to drink my coffee. This is fantastic. And I did want to disabuse anybody of the notion that this idea of questions arising surrounding fair play with Facebook's IPO is somehow a revelation, is somehow like, oh my God, what a big deal. This is what happens every day. I think back to the Iran-Contra scandal, right? That if I get this was a long time ago, my brain, I don't quite get it all right now, but back in the 1980s, the Reagan administration wanted to fund the Contra army that was fighting against the Sandinista rebels in Nicaragua, the Sandinista. So there was this struggle going on, and it was viewed by Congress as somehow being anathema to democratic ideals, because I think there was a democratic Congress. And so what did the Reagan administration do? They sold weapons to Iran as a way to fund the Contras in Central America. And then there was this huge, this huge trial and big hearings in front of Congress. I think this was like 1986 or 87, because all of this, Oliver North, remember the Colonel Oliver North, he did it because he was patriotic. And so what? So there are these big trials. Nothing changed. It wasn't as if there were reforms enacted that would stop these kinds of activities from happening. And it's not just a Republican thing. If the Obama administration believed that there were certain actions it had to undertake, say one thing, do another, based upon what they thought was in the best interest of maintaining the status of the nation, they would do it. I mean, isn't it the Obama administration that keeps sanctioning the attacks by these unmanned aircraft called drones, dropping bombs on people? Is that bad? I don't know. Some people on the right would say it's fine. Some people on the left would say it's terrible. A bunch of people in the middle probably are kind of wavering back and forth. So, yeah, this whole thing about questions of fair play and IPOs and business and what businesses do, please, when you hear this news that somehow these banks are playing off their investors against each other. I mean, these people call themselves the market makers. That's what they do. They make markets. These folks who are in that top 1%, these corporations, they make money when the economy tanks, and they make money when the economy soars. They make money shorting the markets when things get bad, and they make money playing the markets. Either way, their portfolios are going to go up because they have access to information that we don't have. And they have access to high-speed trading algos that we don't have. And they have access to politicians that we don't have. And that's just how it is. If you don't like it, you have to figure out a way to change the way our political system operates. Because these are not economic issues. These are political issues. I'm not talking about economics now. When I talk about Goldman Sachs and Citibank and Bank of America and monetary policy, it has nothing to do with economics. It's all about politics and law. If you believe that there should be a rule of law and not a rule of men, if you believe that law should be paired out equally and should be administered equally to people regardless of their station in society, then you're going to have to do something. And you're going to have to create change, political change, legal change, change in legal precedent. How you do that? Do you do that at the polls? Maybe you do that at the polls. Do you do that through nonviolent protest? Maybe you do that through nonviolent protest. Do you do that? But these are political issues. This idea of questions of fair play with IPOs and Facebook and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, these are not economic issues. It has to do with regulation and it has to do with politics. The big mega banks cheat. The big mega banks lie. The big mega banks employ fraud as a way to make money. The big mega banks, to a great extent, don't care if the market goes up or down because they make money either way. Those are legal, regulatory, and political issues. They have little, if anything, to do with economics. Angry Moderate. Feeling a little saucy today. Feeling a little agitated. Maybe it was the Heath bar that I had on the way over here. The chocolate, sugar, and caffeine kind of got me ramped up. Because regardless of all these issues, it's a beautiful day out there, right? Sunny, couple of clouds, nice breeze, right? I work outdoors, so I've got my outdoor kind of tan going. Life is good, yeah? Okay. Back to the New York Times. Letters to the editor, another biggie. So what have we talked about so far? We talked about politics, and we've talked about law, and we've talked about economics kind of in an ancillary way because we're talking about initial public offerings and stocks, but really what we're talking about is what's the law, what's the regulation, who can game the system, who can't game the system. I can't game the system, but my friends, the hedge fund guys who lives down in Wall Street, they can totally game the system, and they do game the system. Now let's talk about religion. Let's cover all of it today. We're not going to cover much on sports. I did that last time, right? Talking a little celebration about my Southampton Saints, my soccer team. Let's talk about religion, shall we? Okay. So there's a letter to the editor here in the New York Times. This is, again, May 24th, 2012, and it's entitled Romney's Faith. Now, if you weren't aware, Mitt Romney is going to, unless something weird happens, he's the presumptive Republican nominee for president. We're presuming that he is going to get the nomination. Now, of course, people could show up at Republicans at the convention and be like, not so much. But, Mitt Romney will be the Republican nominee for president. It'd be interesting to see who he's going to pick as his VP candidate. Not because I care, as in oh my gosh, but just out of sort of a interesting, oh, that, yeah. Anyway, here's the letter to the editor. To the editor, Romney's faith, silent but deep, applying Mormonism lessons in life and campaign. This is referring to an article from May 20th. This person, Claire Cafaro from Fort Collins, Colorado, writes, Ann Romney is quoted as saying of running for president that the Romneys both, quote, felt it was what God wanted them to do. Then she says, that perception always reminds me of Susan B. Anthony's comment, quote, I distrust those people who know so well what God wants them to do because I notice that it always coincides with their own desires. Ha ha! Right on. Oh, yeah. I'm with you, Claire, right? Look, you know, in this day and age, it is really risque to rail on religion, right? I mean, for me to sit here, the angry moderate, and to denigrate, to say bad things about organized religion would be way too risque. So I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to say is that it is always interesting to me when individuals, whether they be on the left or on the right, somehow seem to parlay religion into either financial or social gain. I love these guys. Like televangelists, I love these guys because they somehow have figured out a way to become unbelievably wealthy and at the same time create this weird perception among their followers that they are reverent, faithful servants of God. These are the true geniuses of the snake oil sales world. I lived in Oklahoma City for a year, teaching at a prep school and coaching some sports, blah, blah, blah. And you know, it's a fairly conservative state. It's a bit of an understatement. And it's a very religious state. And what I found interesting was that there was just as much unethical, amoral behavior that I could see going on in Oklahoma as there was or is in other states. And yet somehow the people that I was watching were able to feel okay about some of the things that they were doing because at the same time they were going to church. And I was sort of like, this is rather interesting. And I, you know, and I couldn't quite, and then, so I worked at a school that was a religiously affiliated school. And I remember we would have these daily chapel thingies, and it was fine. I mean, look, quiet time, time for meditation and reflection, I'm down with that. You know, people getting up and talking about biblical or whatever kinds of religious passages and applying those to, you know, life lessons, I'm down with that, fine. But what was so interesting to me in these conversations or these presentations at chapel was that sometimes they would be tweaked in a way that was very self-serving. And I was like, ooh, this is, I don't know what to make of this. And I would sit there in my chair on the bench, like, first we had chapel in the cafeteria, and then they reopened the church. It was beautiful. But I would sit there and I would kind of be in my chair, sort of looking down, going, I'm feeling way uncomfortable right now. Not because the word God was being used, not because of religion itself, but because of how the stories, you know, that you hear about, whether it be Old Testament, New Testament, whether it be, you know, the holy books of other religions, were somehow being tweaked as a way to justify certain actions. Like one sports coach got up and gave a talk about how she told her team that a certain figure in our history, our religious history, would have been okay with if someone, you know, smacks you on the face, you get up and smack them back. Like, so this particular coach said, so what I learned, you know, Jewish, okay? But what I learned from my religious studies and from, you know, studying Gandhi and other, you know, kind of interesting and sort of righteous dudes was that, you know, if the idea of, okay, so if someone strikes you on the cheek, you offer them the other cheek, right? You don't fight back, but you kind of... So this particular sports coach said, no, if someone strikes you on the cheek, what Jesus was really saying is that you get up and you smack them. And I was like, oh, I'm feeling really uncomfortable now because there are all these middle schoolers sitting there, right? And I'm like, I don't want the middle schoolers get this is the... So anyway, it always makes me feel kind of uncomfortable when religion is used for personal gain and when people tweak the messages, of which there are some great messages in biblical text or whatever religious text, as a way to, aggrandize themselves. And clearly politicians are the worst about this. I mean, they will unabashedly and with no shame whatsoever get up there and invoke, God bless this and God bless that, when in the back of their heads that might not be what they're thinking. Anything for a vote, right? Anything because really, self-interest, right? Guided by self-interest. So I'm with you, Claire Cafaro from Fort Collins, who said that the perception always reminds me of Susan B. Anthony. Yes. Awesome historical figure. When she said, I distrust those people who know so well what God wants them to do because I notice it always coincides with their own desires, right? So this brings me to the topic of same-sex marriage, which I've talked about before, but which just totally, right? Wasn't it recently in North Carolina? Didn't North Carolina pass a constitutional amendment to bar same-sex marriage? Am I on target here? Didn't it? I think this happened in the last month, right? That somehow God doesn't want men who love each other to get married and women who love each other to get married. That somehow someone can go through the Bible and go, yeah, there it is right there. I don't want gay people getting married. And astounding to me that we are having this conversation about same-sex marriage in 2012. Astounding to me that there are states that are trying to and clearly succeeding in banning same-sex marriage. Unbelievable to me how embarrassing it is. How embarrassing it is that some of our states in this country think that if you're a man and you want to marry a man, that somehow that's a bad thing. And if you're a woman and you want to marry... Unbelievable. So embarrassing. It's one of those oh boy. Right? When I was at college, 1980s, right? And you traveled in Europe. That was one of the rites of passage. So at the end of college, I, had a little bit of money, not much. And I bought a plane ticket over to France, didn't know any French, threw my backpack on my back, had my guitar, was going to be a minstrel traveling, Didn't quite work out that way. But I was going to travel through Europe, and what people said was, well, don't put an American flag on your backpack because people aren't so psyched about Americans. If you want, why don't you put a Canadian maple, the Canadian flag or something? People in Europe like the Canadians. They don't like the Americans. And I was like, well, I'm not going to put anything on my backpack. But I did find that there were times I had to defend, but I'm not. I didn't vote for him, but I was embarrassed. I mean, I was embarrassed to have Ronald Reagan as a president. I was embarrassed that my country had voted for Ronald Reagan, as Christopher Lloyd said in Back to the Future, the actor, as president. I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed about the policies that he carried out or that he promoted as president. I was embarrassed about his role in certain scandals. I was embarrassed that over 50% of the electorate found him to be acceptable intellectually, politically, morally, etc., to lead the country. That was kind of like one of those, oh yeah, wouldn't have been my choice, but this whole same-sex marriage thing, same deal. Totally embarrassing that we're having this conversation. It's a non-issue. You are a man and you love a man, mazel tov, get married, life is good. You are a woman and you love a woman and you want to get married, mazel tov, Get married, isn't it wonderful? And the fact that we're having this conversation, and the fact that states like North Carolina or whatever are voting to ban gay marriage, like, who are these people? Well, they're the religious right. They are the religious right who are somehow using religion as a way to express their bigotry. There, I've said it. It's bigotry being hidden by religion as a way to justify that bigotry. The same way that patriotism is often used as a way to justify bigotry. People hide behind the flag, but what they're really expressing sometimes is bigotry. They hide behind the flag and say things like, well, Barack Obama, he loves Muslims. They're using patriotism and they're using the flag as a way to hide behind bigotry. The angry moderate is not a bigot. I'm only bigoted about coffee. My only prejudice has to do with which bean I'm going to grind today. My only prejudice? Well, I am somewhat prejudiced in favor of certain sports teams. But seriously, the whole gay and lesbian marriage thing, the fact that this is an issue in this country in 2012, totally embarrassing. Totally embarrassing. And we're going to look back in 50 years and we're going to be like, whoa, that was a bad moment for us. And North Carolina is going to look back in 30 years and people in North Carolina are going to be like, oh, we kind of dropped the ball on that one. That was dumb. Yeah, right? Just the way a lot of states look back on the 1950s and 60s and say, yeah, that was bad. Yeah, that's embarrassing. So, yeah, lost on that one. Here's one more religion issue here from the New York Times. To the editor, Maureen Dowd writes, quote, absolute intolerance is always a sign of uncertainty and panic, end quote. And then this person, the Reverend Charles W. Pappenfuss, it's a tough name, writes, no, it isn't. Sometimes it's a sign of conviction and the courage to speak out against what it considers to be wrong. Absolute intolerance is always a sign of uncertainty, and then this reverend says, no, sometimes it's a sign of conviction and courage. If you are someone and you have a certain series of beliefs, if you are a religious person and you interpret the Bible or whatever, you interpret whatever as saying that, I'll come back to gay marriage, that people of the same sex shouldn't be together as a couple, they shouldn't get married, and that's your conviction, and you state it publicly, whatever, okay? As far as I'm concerned, that's bigotry, but okay, so whatever, you've done your thing. Isn't it a different step when you take those views and you try to parlay them into political influence, or you try to aggrandize yourself as a leader by expressing these views and fomenting the public to get behind you? Yeah, and we should make sure that men can't marry men and women can't marry women, right? Yeah, and everyone's like, yeah, right? Right? It's like, reminds me of that scene in the movie The Lord of the Rings, that trilogy, where the what's his name, the evil guy with the long white hair, Saruman, when he gets all of they are taking your land, go destroy them, and all of them are like, oh, yeah, right? And they're all, in the teeth, and, right? Fictitious characters who have been seduced by a powerful sorcerer, not so far from reality, right? Seduced by sorcerers. The only difference is, in one case, the sorcerer is Saruman, with his, cool fingers as he does with what's the thing called, the little ball that he can look into. And Glenn Beck, right? Glenn Beck is like the Saruman of AM radio. And people are like, yeah, Glenn Beck, all he's doing is making money. His whole shtick, his whole thing about, socialism, that entire show, it's like Howard Stern for the political right. His whole show is just about making money. At least Howard Stern's honest about it. Howard Stern's like, yeah, hey now, I'm just here to make money. Great, right? But Glenn Beck's whole thing is he gets those people who are like the people in Lord of the Rings, like these creatures in Lord of the Rings, you know, like, ah, right? And they go off and they pillage the villages. All Glenn Beck is doing is he's doing the same thing. I wonder if Lord of the Rings was actually created as sort of a parody of AM radio. I know it's not. I know it was written before the popularity of AM radio. But the analogy is a pretty good one. I mean, there's some connection there. I mean, all of the people who listen to Glenn Beck and believe everything he says and then call back and parrot back, all of people who listen to Rush Limbaugh and not only agree with him, but call him up. They're like, Mr. Limbaugh, it is such a pleasure to talk to a true patriot like you. And he's like, well, yes, I'm the smartest patriot. What he's really saying is, making more money. All these suckers who believe what I say about Obama, the socialist. Right? They're just Saruman for AM radio. So when this guy, the Reverend Charles W. Pappenfuss, says that absolute intolerance is actually a sign of conviction and courage, you know, it's one thing to have views and to stand by them even if they are intolerant. That's your business. But when you parlay that into political authority, when you parlay that into financial gain, or when you use that intolerance as a way to create laws that limit the freedoms of other people, then I'm like, no. I feel like, you know, Mandy Patinkin in The Princess Bride. You wouldn't happen to have 6 fingers on your right hand, would you? No. Now you've crossed the line. You want to be intolerant and bigoted, your business, right? You want to sit in your living room and say nasty things about people, whatever. You vote for laws that are based upon bigoted views, based upon interpretations of religious text, that limit the amount of freedom that other people have, that limit the freedom that certain people have, or that limit their access to whatever. No, you cannot do that. That's wrong in a democratic society that supposedly is about the rule of law. Supposedly about the rule of law. This is about to be Memorial Day weekend, and I work over the weekend, so I have to drive down to Boston and do the work that I do from Friday until Monday, and then come back to the beautiful, bucolic, and relaxing, a little quiet, and at times a tad calm, for me, Upper Valley. You know, there are times when I kind of pine for the days when I lived in Somerville, Massachusetts, you know, and it was interesting, right? You know, it was kind of like a whole diverse cultural, socioeconomic thing going on. Maybe the Upper Valley is a little quieter than the beautiful, great schools. Kids go to a great school. Wonderful people. Progressive in that way of like looking at doing things in a you know, together in a communal way. The whole farming movement, locavores, love all that. Got to make a little extra trip to get to Montreal or Boston occasionally just to get my urban fix, if you will. So anyway, I guess the purpose or the point of this entire Angry Moderate Ramble Fest, which is what I do every 2 weeks here at CATV, and again, amazed that you would take the time to watch. If you've watched this segment, then, you know, as they say on Car Talk, you've wasted another hour listening to my brother and my brother, you know, those guys. Click and Clack, the Tappick brothers. I love how they laugh at each other, right? They're sitting, you know why they're laughing? They're laughing all the way to the bank. They're like, ha ha ha, muffler, that's $50. Muffler, that's another $50. Muffler, right? That you've sat there and you've listened to me babble on, but then I did make a couple of, I think, important points. And I think the most important points that I made during this segment had to do with the fact that if you are, I don't want to say foolish, because that's not really, that's kind of a It's not very nice. But if you believe that somehow our economic system, our financial system, is equitable and is a free market system, then you're not paying careful attention. You know, when writers talk about, or when people talk about an IPO being, maybe it wasn't fair, well, of course it wasn't fair. There are two very distinct classes of individuals, the financial class and everyone else, and those people who are part of that financial system, of course they're going to get insider information. Of course they're going to be able to game the markets, to push the markets up or to push them down as a way to benefit themselves. Of course they're going to front-run the bond market as a way to make profits for themselves. And of course people are going to be hurt along the way. And then I said, well, maybe that's okay. Maybe to have a country in which the standard of living is across the board higher than other countries, it's okay to live in sort of this neo-feudal weird place where you have mega billionaires and soon-to-be trillionaires who control the market, who are the market makers, who game the markets, and other people kind of get laid by the waist. They fall off and things fall apart for a lot of people, but there's that small group of individuals who are able to keep gaming the market one way or the other as a way to make profits for themselves. And those monies that enter the system somehow create a standard of living maybe that's okay. That's kind of for you to figure out, I guess. For me, I have to say, I have trouble with that because I have this it's not a moral streak. I don't want to use the word moral because that's very preachy and self, that's like, oh, I'm so moral. It's like a fairness streak. I have something inside like that when things aren't fair, I get the hair stands up and it's like, no. And I have another streak, which is the hypocrisy streak, right? Where when people are saying one thing and doing another, when my university, which has a motto, truth even unto its innermost parts, has stocks that are invested in companies that are doing business with evil governments, I'm like, no, we can't do that. You can either change the motto or change the investments. You want to invest in companies that are creating surveillance cameras that are spying on people and those people are being killed by dictatorships, then change the motto to truth as long as it benefits us economically, or change the investments. And then the fairness thing. Like, it always makes me feel very uncomfortable that we have a legal system that everybody touts as being equal. People are viewed as equal under the law, and it's just not true. It's just not true. If you are a person of means, you can purchase a better lawyer. You can purchase your way out of jail with bail. You can do all sorts of things that a person who is poor cannot do. And so that's not equality under the law. And then finally, the final piece of this week's diatribe is about this idea of people using religion as a way to express bigotry. Look, in the end, I have virtually no problem with religion, and I know people who work in religion, who are religious people, who are pastors and ministers, who are probably some of the most righteous and amazing human beings that I know. Amazing human beings that I know. The minister of the church, the leader of the Unitarian church that my family goes to in Woodstock, one of the most extraordinary human beings I've ever met in my life. A man with whom I coach soccer, who also works in the church, one of the most extraordinary human beings I've ever met in my life. These are amazing men and amazing women who work in religion and who are part of church or synagogue or mosque or whatever. But when people use religion to express bigotry, and they use religion as a way to tweak law and to create or foment for themselves, to create power for themselves, to aggrandize themselves, or to create law that then is applied unequally toward people based upon ethnicity, based upon sexual preference, then it's like, no, done. Totally done. That's when I can be a very, very adamant anti-religion voice when that's happening. Anyway, the Angry Moderate will be signing off in a couple of minutes. I just want to say, I wrote a book. I did. I'm going to point to this camera over here. I wrote a book Talk about self-aggrandizing, right? Last year, it's about coaching youth sports, but it's also kind of about spirituality, et cetera, and so forth. So you don't have to buy it. You know how many copies I've sold? I think I've sold 17, and I think I bought 15 of them. But if you're interested in the Bodhisattva on the sideline, you have no way to contact me, so you're going to have to Google it, the Bodhisattva on the sideline. Angry Moderate, signing off. Have a great couple of weeks. See you soon.